My friends, we are in Exodus this morning, and we made dazzling progress last week, so we are in chapter 1. Chapter 1, and we'll be picking up at verse 15. I hope you can, I brought a map today. Candy was giving me a bad time. This is feeling a little bit like school, you know. The map up there, to which I said this is Sunday school, so this is the point. We're going to try to do a little bit of history and a little bit of geography, and there will be a test. And you don't want to flunk Sunday school. That's not good. So you better pay attention. I apologize. I can't come up with a map that's a little more, bigger. You know, I realize if you're in the back row, that's maybe just an academic exercise for you. There is a map here. You know, if you see that blurry thing there, that's what you're looking at. But hopefully this will give us a little bit of help as we think about the events of the Exodus. I'll have this here at least occasionally as we're moving along, especially when geography may help us understand what the text is saying. What I'd like to do today, just before we get started really with the text, is just kind of once again get us oriented, generally speaking, to the overall chronology of these events of the ancient world, especially biblical chronology. I don't want to go into this in detail, but it may at least get us kind of oriented to some degree to places and times. It's not easy, of course, to nail down with certainty the date of the birth of Abraham, but I think there's at least a general understanding that he was born around the year 2000. I'm putting the date of his birth at 1951, which appears to be much more precise than it probably is, but it sounds good, you know. So 1951. But if you follow a fairly straightforward facial chronology of the Old Testament, you know there's a fair amount of chronological data provided for us. That's probably pretty close. There are those who put his date considerably earlier, and I've seen as early as maybe 2100 BC, but usually they do that on the mistaken assumption that Israel was in Egypt for a full 400 years. And of course, last week, you recall, we fixed that problem, didn't we? So we know that it was only something like 215 years, and that makes everything come out a little bit more neatly as far as we try making it match with what we otherwise know. So Abraham is born. He's born in Ur of the Chaldees. That's this region over here, Mesopotamia. Ur, you'll see right there, was the third major dynasty in the ancient world. There had been Sumer, first of all, then Akkad, and then Ur. Ur is the third of them. Ur fell in about the year 2000 BC. Abraham was born shortly after that. So he's born more or less into the ruins of a prior great civilization. He saw the remnants of a former great age, but that wasn't necessarily his own experience of that culture. It was a time of significant migration. Abraham is not the only one that migrated. We know there were a lot of people migrating out of Mesopotamia. That is my cell phone. Can you believe that? Somebody's calling me in the middle of Sunday school. I tell you. You see, you're supposed to turn your cell phone off. So there you are. Apologize for that. It was the IRS. They wondered where I am. I decided not to answer. So Abraham, along with many others, migrates out of Mesopotamia, up the Euphrates, up to Haran, then down, of course, to Canaan. Now that's the first great events that we find in the book of Genesis. The next date I'd like to highlight with you is 1662, so some 300 years later. This would be the date, generally we would say, in which Jacob travels to Egypt with his family and with that larger community that was associated with Jacob. Last week we indicated it may have been upwards of 1,500 to 2,000 people or so that traveled with Jacob when, during the famine, he migrates to Egypt at the insistence of his son Joseph, and of course you know that story. This is right in the middle of the era in which Egypt is ruled, that is, northern Egypt, or what's called Lower Egypt, is ruled by the Hyksos. You'll notice it's a little counterintuitive, but northern Egypt is called Lower Egypt. Southern Egypt is called Upper Egypt, because the topography here is much lower. This is closer to sea level, so it's called lower in terms of its altitude, not in terms of, north and south. So this is where the Hyksos are ruling. They never ruled down in the south, but they do dominate for a couple of hundred years the political life of Lower Egypt, or northern Egypt. And it's right in the middle of that time that Jacob migrates into Egypt. And at least to some degree that may explain why there's a fairly warm relationship between the ruling family and the people who come with Jacob. They're both Semitic in their background, and they share, at least to some degree, as modest as it might be, a common cultural heritage. And so for that reason, maybe for others, there's this rather filial connection, you might say. Joseph dies in 1595. So the end of the book of Genesis really comes right about there. That's the last major event that's found in the book of Genesis. Exodus does not pick up much later, because what we find is that in 1570, only 25 years later, a new king arises who doesn't know Joseph. This is not to say he doesn't know about Joseph. It's not that he's ignorant of Joseph or his career or the important contribution that he made, but he doesn't know him in any kind of friendly or affectionate kind of way. Because, of course, Amos, as we learned last week, is the one who drove out the Hyksos and reestablished native Egyptian control. And they hated the Hyksos, and they hated along with them that whole Semite population. And that probably accounts politically for the change in the disposition of the ruling house toward the Israelites who were there. Amos ruled, and by the way, the dates I'm giving you at this point are just standard, straight up, right down the middle, accepted dates by Egyptologists. These are not my dates now. I'm just accepting them as they've been given commonly. So the first three rulers of the 18th dynasty of Egypt are, first of all, Amos, and we mentioned him last week. He's the one that drives out the Hyksos. He's the one who doesn't know Joseph, and he's the one who appears then to institute a new policy toward the people of God who are living there in Egypt. A couple of little sort of details or trivia, I guess we'll say, about Amos. For one thing, he is the first Egyptian pharaoh to... Is that a drum roll? I'm about to say something really dramatic here. He's the first Egyptian ruler to give to the Egyptians a standing army. Up until this point, Egypt had always been defended by an army that was raised ad hoc at the moment of the need. Kind of volunteer army, you might say. But because Amos was so fearful of a reinvasion by the Hyksos, he actually hires and maintains a standing army to guard the borders of Egypt. Egypt is a relatively easily defended nation. You've got this little narrow kind of attack way through here, so that was pretty easy to defend. And to the south, the threat was not quite as significant. And so Egypt had not required a standing army. But now, with this most recent difficulty with the Hyksos, he says, we're going to have an army. And we're going to put these people on a payroll, and that's going to be the way we do business from this point on. The other thing that is an innovation under Amos is the use of chariots. Egypt had never used chariots until the rule of Amos. Why would that be of interest to us in the study of the Exodus? Because we hear that there were a bunch of chariots that were flooded, right? And if Egypt hadn't started using chariots yet, we would have a bit of a problem explaining why all those chariots were baptized in the Red Sea there. But as it turns out, that is not a problem, and that they were using chariots at that time. And so that's a couple of things about him. He rules for about 24 years. Is that right? Yeah, 24 years. He's followed by a guy named Amenhotep I. Don't know much about him, but he seems to be the pharaoh now who is going to be a player in the story we look at this morning. So he seems to be the one who ratchets up the hostility toward the Jewish people. Remember, Amos, probably somewhere along the way, maybe halfway through his career or later, had begun to reduce the status of the Jewish people, making them more a slave population than a free population as they had been. Amenhotep seems to be the one who just kicks up the pressure a little more and implements this policy of infanticide that we see introduced in the story this morning and in part of chapter 2. And he rules then. He does not have a son to succeed him. This is important. Okay, I know you're thinking, so who cares? You care. Listen to me. Amenhotep only has a daughter. And because he's concerned about succession to the throne, he wants to find a suitable person to marry his daughter to perpetuate this dynastic rule that he's part of. And so he takes a general from that standing army of his, a very respected and competent guy, and marries him to his royal daughter. And that man's name is Thutmose I. So Thutmose comes in as a military guy, and because the Egyptians reckoned the dynasty through the women rather than through the men, it continues this legitimate notion of an 18th dynasty. All right, Thutmose is married to the royal daughter of Amenhotep. He also has trouble producing an appropriate heir, but he does produce a remarkable female daughter whose name is, does anybody know, by the way, this is one of the most famous female names in Egyptian history, and you may know it. You may have actually visited her mortuary temple there near Karnak in Egypt, and her name is, anybody know? It's hard to say. Hatshepsut. Ever heard of her? Hatshepsut. Okay, so that's. Now, here's the theory, just to let the cat slightly out of the bag. We cannot prove this with any degree of confidence, but in terms of circumstantial evidence, there is a fairly compelling case that can be made that it is that same Hatshepsut who was the daughter of Pharaoh who found Moses floating in the reeds there along the Nile River, you see. Now, again, we don't have any, the Bible doesn't give us a name, it just says the daughter of Pharaoh. But this is a case that's been made by, I think, some fairly competent scholars, and it's one that I find at least intriguing, if not compelling. So I'm going to play with that with you this morning, that is, in fact, who we're dealing with, and it may at least help us understand to some degree some of the events that are described. Fair enough? So let's take a look at the text that we're coming to this morning. We left off last week at Exodus chapter 1, beginning at verse 15 is where we'll pick up. We'll just read the rest of chapter 1 and then make as much progress as we can into chapter 2 as time permits. So Exodus chapter 1, verse 15, the Word of God. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They're vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. So there's this somewhat unusual, of course many of these paragraphs are unusual, but this one is even more so. Let's ask God's blessing on our time together. Heavenly Father, we are grateful to you for this great story that comes to us out of the pages of the Old Testament, and we give you thanks that we can gain insights and lessons applicable to each of our lives from these ancient texts. We pray that the same Spirit that was governing these events in the providence of your wisdom would be with us this morning to help us understand and appreciate them. And we give you thanks for these things in the name of Christ. Amen. All right. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, and then it goes on. So, who is this king of Egypt? Very likely it is the next king. So the first part of this chapter was probably talking about Amos without telling us. We have now a shift probably to the second of these. We know that this has to be the kind of thing that's happening. The text doesn't tell us the next Pharaoh, but it's implied at least by the way it's stated. And so we're guessing that Amenhotep, about whom we don't have a lot of information, nevertheless is continuing the policy of his father. But noticing that this imposition of a slave status is not having the desired effect. These people are continuing to multiply and grow and become vigorous. And of course, as all slave cultures have learned, the potential for an uprising among the slaves is always a risk, a peril that one has to watch out for. And it's always a bit of a delicate balance, you see. Every slave culture that's ever existed has to walk a tightrope because on the one hand, you want the slave population to multiply. I mean, I know this is crass to put it this way, but the fact is they're viewed as virtually as just intelligent beasts, and part of your wealth is to have an increasing population of them. But on the other hand, the more there are of those slaves, the more potential for an uprising you're dealing with. So it's always this kind of delicate problem, and you see a little bit of that even here. So the king of Egypt is aware of this ongoing risk, apparently, of some sort of rebellion, and because of that, he decides to try to impede the reproduction of these people. And so he talks to these two midwives. Now, these are not the two midwives for the whole population. These are Egyptian names. These are Egyptian women. And their task is to oversee, in a sense, the reproductive activities of the slave population generally, to make sure that these things are happening very much the way you might do it in breeding cattle. I mean, I realize that's insulting to our sensibilities to put it that way, but that's the way it was. And so these people have a somewhat responsible position of carrying on the midwifery, you see there, among this population. And these are Egyptian women, apparently. At least that's the common view. Josephus takes that view, and it's been the traditional view in Jewish understanding, and I think it's correct in terms of their names. So here are these two women, Shiphrah and Puah, who were told, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women, notice not maybe to all the slave population, but to those in particular, and you see them on the birth stool. That's an interesting word. It's an Egyptian word. The birth stool, I mean, that's an English word, but behind it is an Egyptian word. And we actually have hieroglyphs from this era that have a device that goes by the same Egyptian name. I can't pronounce the word for you, but it was a kind of furniture device that was intended for childbirth. And so that's the term that's used there. It's true to the time, in other words. If it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, she shall live. So at this point, we're going to do that which is a little bit counterproductive in terms of the slave population, try to impede growth by taking out the male children, letting the female children live. And so that is the policy that's put in place. The midwives, however, feared God. This is a term that would typically be used to describe a non-Jewish person and their perspective of a kind of rudimentary faith to the God of Israel. They were called God-fearing. And so the fact that these two are described as God-fearing suggests, again, they were Egyptian, but they realized there was more going on here than meets the eye, that somehow or other God is involved in this population. And so it seems to lead them to have they're caught in this very ticklish position. They've got the Pharaoh on the one hand, but they have this fear of this deity who seems to be among the Hebrews on the other. And so they do this little device to avoid the problem. The midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them. They let the boys live. Word of this comes back to the king. The king summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this?" and allowed the boys to live. This, one commentator called this typical Jewish smart humor. If you look through the Old Testament, you find this kind of wry humor again and again in Jewish literature, and this is a good example of it, where these women apparently then are saying to the Pharaoh, well, you know, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptians. They're vigorous. They give birth before we can get there. And so we're just not able to keep up, is the idea. I don't know if that satisfied the Pharaoh or not. No further comment is made on the subject, but you can't help but smile a little bit at the explanation that's given. And so, for whatever reasons, the birth population is not retarded by this policy. God dealt well with the midwives. It says the people continued to multiply as the force of this, continued to be strong or get stronger. So in spite of this more harsh policy, it doesn't seem to have its desired effect. This next statement is rather difficult because the midwives feared God. He gave them families. Jewish commentators on this text generally take this to mean, and it's been generally accepted, that the meaning of this is because these Egyptian midwives feared God, he gave them family status among the Hebrews. Not that he gave them families in and of itself, which may or may not be the case, but that somehow they became more accepted in the community of the Jewish people. That's tentative. I'm not saying that's a certainty, but it's a difficult phrase to translate in the first place. And then the meaning of it, once you do translate it, isn't really very clear. But that seems to be the best theory going, so I'm going to suggest that one to you. That these midwives became included, as it were, in the Jewish community, and may actually, years later, they or their descendants participated in the Exodus, would be at least possibly the implication there. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews, you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall keep every girl alive. So now we have a third strategy, more severe than the last one. The first one, slave status. The second one, kind of this trying to catch these children as they're being born, expose them so that the boys die. The third one now, even more ferocious, throw them into the Nile. It seems that each of these three is separated by time, and I'm going to suggest to you that the third of these comes now toward the end of the reign of Amenhotep, down around the year 1524. Okay, so we'll hold on to that thought. Let's go ahead and look at the next chapter. We're at chapter 2. We'll take the first 4 verses. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket, literally an ark, and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. I read this story, and as if it were yesterday, I see the flannel graph again. Don't you? How many of you remember this? I mean, this is such a great Bible story. And you see the reeds, you see the little ark there, and you see Miriam off looking through the bushes, and these are wonderful stories. God has been very good to us, not only to give us great, deep, profound theology in the Scriptures, but to give us wonderful stories that appeal even to a 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old. And those are the ways that, that initial education is inculcated into us. So I'm grateful for my Sunday school teachers when I was a little child who told me these stories, because they've been with me all these years, and now it's my turn to tell them to you. I just wish I had the flannel graph. I joked about that last week, or last year, and somebody brought me some flannel graph stuff, so, you know, you drop enough hints and no telling what's going to... All right, but anyway, let's look at the story. You've got the flannel graph in your mind now. What's going on? Well, there's a man from the house of Levi who went and married a Levite woman. There's a subtlety here already. The very mention of the tribe of Levi is in itself interesting because so far in the narrative, that is all the way through Genesis, Levi has been a bit of a bad guy. You may recall the unfortunate incident that took place at Shechem, in which two sons of Jacob went and slaughtered a bunch of the male inhabitants, the young men in that community. If you don't remember that story, it's back around Genesis 38 or so. And in that situation, Levi and Simeon are the two guys who are really given to violence. And later, in Genesis, when Jacob pronounces his kind of final benediction before his death on each of these two guys don't get very good treatment. Simeon and Levi are described as violent, bloodthirsty men, and Jacob says what sounds like a judgment on both of them. They will be scattered throughout Israel, you see, as if they will lose their identity. Simeon, that is virtually what happens. You never hear much about the tribe of Simeon in later Jewish history. They were out there, they had a very small region that belonged to them, but they were kind of distributed. Levi was also distributed, but in a very different way. Levi, of course, became the priestly tribe, and for them, the distribution turned out to be a great blessing. So it shows that even at the time that something seemed to be bad news for them, nevertheless there was something else that God had in mind. Now this is the first signal of some kind of positive view of the tribe of Levi. So Exodus begins by singling out Levi, and of course we'll hear a lot more about that as the story unfolds. So we have a marriage now that takes place in this Levite tribe. The implication is that this marriage and this birth of this child, Moses, takes place in a very immediate context of the new rule to throw these children into the Nile, that this is taking place just kind of in that very moment, and so it's that accounts in some ways for the sense in which the story is told here. The woman conceived, bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. Now, I don't know what mother has ever given birth and not thought, that's a fine baby. You know, I mean, this is wired in, isn't it? So it might seem like this is remarking the obvious, that the mother of Moses thought, well, that's a fine baby, but commentators tend to think that there's more here than just maternal appreciation of that beautiful little baby that they've just given birth to, that somehow or other, at least the way it's stated, implies that the mother of Moses knew there was more going on, that somehow she had some sense that there was significance to this child. And so she was willing to, she would probably be willing to run this risk anyway. What mother wouldn't? But in this case, even to run a more perilous risk of protecting this child, believing that somehow or other God is in this. That at least, it's not stated, it's only subtle, but I think there's good reason to think that's implied. If you read the sermon given by Stephen in Acts chapter 7, in which he's construing this story, he virtually says that. And so that seems to be the construction of it that the New Testament takes, and I think it's legitimate to see it that way. Well, this fine baby that's born is, of course, we will learn soon enough, Moses. When is he born? Well, if you know the story of Moses, you know that Moses' story is in kind of 3 great chapters, isn't it? He dies at 120 years old, and each of those chapters is about 40 years in length. These are probably round numbers. It may not be precisely 40 years in each case, but that's the way the Old Testament presents it. That we have Moses, first of all, the first 40 years, Moses where? In Egypt, in the palace, part of the royal family. Adopted in, status, prestige, great education, trained in the arts of probably political science in Egypt, being groomed for some very high status, and some would suggest he was being groomed, if it was indeed Hatshepsut, who was his adoptive mother, groomed for the throne. Could be, you see, that it was that much prestige that he was enjoying in those first 40 years. Then you've got a regime change. Things change. And the next 40 years of Moses, after he murders the Egyptian, you know the story, we'll get to it eventually, he spends in exile, a place called Midian. Midian is right here. So if you can see this map, I don't know, maybe the next one gives it, yeah. If you can see the map, here's Egypt. Moses escapes across probably the northern part of Mount Sinai over into a region that in the ancient world was called Midian. Today we call it Saudi Arabia. And it was outside the jurisdiction of Egypt. It was safe, and that probably is where Moses expected to spend the rest of his days. So for the next 40 years, there's Moses out on the backside of the desert. And then, of course, we have the burning bush. We have the last 40 years of Moses' life in which he comes back, he leads the people out, and those 40 years are spent in the wilderness probably part of the northern Sinai Peninsula and over in regions somewhat to the west. And so this is all, or I should say to the east. And so this is all taken together as this 120 years of Moses' life divided neatly into these three slices. All right. If the Exodus took place in the year... Quiz. What year was the Exodus? Who remembers? See, I'm going to keep repeating this until you just go to sleep. You go to sleep with the number in your mind, 1447. And you wake up in the morning thinking 1440, that's all I want. Before you read the morning paper, 1447, that number, deliciously hanging in your mind. That's the date we're going to assign to the Exodus that puts it squarely in the middle of the 18th dynasty. Now, if the Exodus was in 1447, and if Moses was 80 years old in round numbers at the time of the Exodus, then when does that put his birth? It would be, quick arithmetic, it'd be about 1527. Okay? Right at the tail end of the reign of Amenhotep. So we're going to just float that trial balloon here. We're going to say Moses, born 1527. And that seems to be the last gasp of this Pharaoh to deal with the problem of these Jewish slaves. It's right toward the tail end of his reign, if indeed it took place on that date. All right, so we're in verse 2. She hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a, this is verse 3 now, got a papyrus. The Hebrew word here is the word ark, A-R-K, for him, plastered it with bitumen, pitch, and she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. Whenever I think about the word ark, I always think of Bill Cosby. You know, how many people remember that hilarious bit that Bill Cosby did? What's an ark? You know, right? That whole thing is. And well, anyway, it's a legitimate question. What is an ark? You ever thought about that? You know, we have this notion of an ark, and you see Noah's Ark. You see arks. Well, an ark is just simply another word for a box. That's all it is. It's just kind of a special box. In the Old Testament, that word, Hebrew word ark, is prominently used 3 times. It's used occasionally elsewhere, but there's 3 distinct times when it really plays rather significantly into the Old Testament narrative. And each time it has a common sort of motif to it. This is not an accident. When is the first time we hear of an ark? It is Noah. Noah's box. Because that's what it was. Not a boat, it wasn't a steamship, it wasn't a cruise liner, you know. It was a big floating barge with about 3 or 4, 3 stories to it, as I recall. And that's what it was. It was not navigable. But it was a safe place in the midst of chaos. That is thematic to the use of the idea of the ark. A safe place in the midst of chaos or threat. The second time we hear of an ark is when Moses is deposited into a tiny little ark, a safe place in the midst of peril, you see. The third time we hear of an ark is what? The Ark of the Covenant, discovered by Indiana Jones in Egypt. Nice box. And that's also, although it's not quite so clear, but remember, what is the most important contents of the ark when we hear about the Ark of the Covenant? The most important thing in it was the Ten Commandments, which stands for order in the midst of chaos. The people of God are going to be ordered by those rules, and they in turn are going to help to order the rest of the world. And so in each of these cases, the idea is that you've got a generalized situation of threat, peril, danger, and God has placed His truth, His way, His treasure in a box, and inside that box it is safe. This is picked up in the New Testament and applied subtly occasionally to the church, so that we, in a sense, are in this place of safety in the midst of what may be a threatening world. And that was definitely the way in the early centuries of the church was understood. Cyprian of Alexandria loved to use the image of the church as an ark, a place of safety in the midst of a chaotic world. But even though you have the 3 times the ark is used, you have many times when you might say the ark motif shows up. The Garden of Eden is kind of like a safe place in the midst of what is otherwise a somewhat unordered creation. Jonah is thrown into the sea, the place of chaos. But then along comes a swimming what? Ark, and puts him in a safe place. And it's from inside that fish that Jonah can pray a prayer of thanksgiving, you know. And if you look for it, you'll see that kind of thing shows up throughout the Old Testament. And the message for us is that, you know, God has placed each of us in His providence in a safe place, but He's looking for us to build out from where we are into the world around us that kind of order, that kind of sensibility. That's why if you live in a nice house and you go out in the spring and plant a garden, you are doing redemptive work. You are indeed expanding the horizons, the borders of orderliness in a chaotic world, you know. If you educate the mind of a child, you are putting order into a place of chaos. Believe me. And you know, you just, but that's our task. It's our redemptive challenge, wherever we are, not to bring destruction, but construction. And it's a wonderful image that runs through the Scriptures, and that, wife, is my practical lesson today in this Sunday school lesson. So, does she give me a bad time? I'm telling you, she just... So, there it is. But here is Moses placed in this ark, and what is going to happen? He's in the midst of chaos, and yet out of that tiny little ark is going to mushroom one of the greatest events of world history, because this little child drawn out of the, drink here is going to become the one that draws the people of God out, and obviously through them the greatest blessings the world has ever known have been realized. So here he is, placed in this modest little ark. I might mention, this is intriguing, I don't want to go anywhere with this, I'm just going to mention it. This is not the only time in ancient history you have this kind of image. Sargon, who was the ruler of the Akkadian dynasty back in, well, it's off my map here, was put in the Euphrates River in a little ark, Romulus and Remus, connected with Rome, were saved by being placed in a little ark, or a little boat in the Tiber River. Even in Japan, you've got a legend of a ruler being saved by being put in. It's almost like it's in our DNA. Something about that image pops up. And I cannot account for that aside from just noting it in passing. It's an interesting little sort of oddity, really, you'd say. But here we have it, at least in the Old Testament, in this connection. All right. She plasters it and puts it in the reeds. His sister stood at the distance to see what would happen to him. This whole thing obviously was set up Mother and daughter concocted this plan, hoping it would play out just the way it does. All right, next paragraph. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, literally it says, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I'll pay you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. And when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him, an Egyptian name, Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Again, famous incident. And I'm going to just work. I want to say this up front. I'm not going to keep apologizing for it. I'm going to just kind of try our Hatshepsut theory by way of construing this. But I don't want anyone to think I'm just teaching as a matter of church dogma here that Hatshepsut was the one. We don't know that. But it is very neat. If she was, it explains a whole lot of what happens in the career of Moses, as we'll see in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So let's just kind of run with that a little bit here. First of all, as we were saying earlier, this is the daughter of Pharaoh probably before he was the Pharaoh. This is the daughter of Thutmose, who had married the daughter of Amenhotep. We know the daughter of Amenhotep could not be the daughter because she was older and there wouldn't be an appropriate daughter who would really fit the bill. She's called the daughter of Thutmose probably before he was Pharaoh because it's common to do that. You will sometimes honor people by designating them according to a status that they will have in the future. So she's called the daughter of Pharaoh because he will someday be the Pharaoh in the not far too distant future, if you follow my point there. So here is Hatshepsut. She is the daughter of Thutmose. He's a major military commander. He is indeed, as it stands now, the heir to the throne. He is, as it were, the crown prince of Egypt in this year, 1527, allowing, or at least assuming that that's the date that it happens. So here she is. We'll say it's Hatshepsut for the fun of it. She came down to bathe at the river while her attendants walked beside the river. This was a common practice. The Nile was worshipped as a god. It was the great source of life for all of Egypt. Had there been no Nile River, there would be no Egypt. Herodotus calls Egypt the gift of the Nile. And Egypt just kind of clutches that lifeline that goes down into Ethiopia, into the mountains of Africa, and flows down into the Delta region here. And the Egyptians were so dependent upon the Nile that they worshipped it, and there was a peculiarly important relationship between the Pharaoh and the Nile. In Egyptian mythology, it was understood that the Pharaoh actually caused the Nile to rise and overflow its banks every spring so they could plant crops. They don't get any rainfall. Their water came from the Nile, and it would be that annual flooding that would create a flood plain that would then create the possibility of crops. And the Pharaoh would go out in the spring. I don't know what was in his... Can you imagine being this guy and going out and hoping for all your life that the Pharaoh, that the Nile's going to rise, but you act like you know what you're doing, and you kind of do this number, and lo and behold, in a few weeks, the Nile comes up, and everybody, congratulates you. Well, that created a very intimate relationship between the family of Pharaoh and the Nile. And it was very common. We have hieroglyphs of this kind of thing where the royal family would bathe in the Nile as if to increase the intimacy between the family on the one hand and the Nile on the other. So what she's doing here is perfectly compatible with what might otherwise have been practiced. The daughter of Pharaoh came out to bathe at the river. Her attendants walk along the shore there. She saw the basket among the reeds. The ark is the word there. And sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying. She took pity on him. This is really one of the most heart-touching moments of course, in the story, certainly, and throughout the Scriptures. And it should remind us that whenever you find in the biblical testimony references to compassion or pity, that kind of human emotion, God's grace is never far away. I think you know that left to ourselves, we can be vicious and cruel and unspeakably and horrifically violent and hard-hearted toward each other. And you don't have to look very far past this morning's newspaper to find that. This is the common sort of theme of the human heart until grace appears. And even if it's just common grace, even if it's not redemptive grace, we have no idea here that this woman had any sort of faith in the true God, but just the very presence of grace at all seems to awaken in her something unusual, namely compassion. We, of course, as Christians celebrate the most compassionate man who ever lived in the history of the planet. And one of the most powerful descriptions of him, as Pastor Jeremy preached so eloquently last week, that splachna. Isn't that a great word? I love that. I love that he used it in the sermon several times. It's a great word to say. You have to kind of mop your mouth after you're done saying it, but splachna. That down there says it's part of your gut, because that's where you feel emotions. You don't feel emotions up here, you feel emotions down here. And the Hebrews located the very heart of our emotional life in the guts and the intestines. And that was the word that they used. And Jesus was the most powerfully compassionate man that the world has ever seen. But there have been many other expressions, lesser expressions of that pity. And this is one of them. It says to us, my friends, that when we see people in trouble, we should feel pity. That doesn't necessarily dictate what you're going to do as a concrete matter of your action. That can be a matter of wisdom, a matter of strategy, practical, approaches to things. But that we should feel something when we see human misery is a mark that God's grace has reached our heart. On the other hand, it's a great warning to us when we see human misery and feel nothing. We should be going back and saying, Lord, what's wrong with me? Because that's part of what grace does to us. And it seems to be part of what grace did to this young woman. Probably around 16 years old, 15, 16, if it is Hatshepsut, that's exactly how old she was, just in her mid-teens. So, here she is, she has pity. Shall I go and, then this Miriam, probably the older sister of Moses, steps up and says, just happens to be there, just walking down the street, happens to notice this. Everybody knows what's going on. Hatshepsut knows what's going on. This whole thing is not lost on her. She's a smart woman, so she knows that this was a kind of a setup here. But Miriam steps forward, presumably the sister, the older sister that we know of later in the story. Shall I go and get a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said, and the Hebrew word here is go, not yes, but go. So she went, got the mother, and the instruction is given. This is, again, a wonderful example of God's rich, turn-on-your-head type blessings that come. Moses' mother would have been thrilled just to have Moses survive. She would have been happy just to have Moses not be done in. But how much more does God do? It reminds me of Paul's statement over Ephesians, exceeding abundantly above all we could ask or think. Ever seen that in your life? Here's Moses' mother just praying that he'll not be killed. And what does she get? She gets her son back. She gets to nurse him, and she gets paid for it to boot. Almost like God's humorous providence in there, just to show how richly he can bless us if we're just simply willing to trust him courageously. And so that's what happens. And Moses is entrusted back to his mother. To a Hebrew reader of this text, that's very important. Part of your solidarity with the Jewish world was established not simply by being born a Jew, but by being nursed in the Jewish community. To them, it's a very earthy kind of culture, and that represents part of what really is that which we would say bonds a child to that community, was this being nursed. And so a Jewish reader of this, even though Moses winds up in the household of Pharaoh for 40 years, or maybe 38 years, 37 years, still he's a Jew in his heart. He's Israel because he was nursed in his early years. And so that is quite important to them as they read a text like this. So when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. So Moses is legally adopted into the royal family. That is at least what it means. It may mean much more than that, but at least Moses is adopted into the royal family and grows up, of course, and receives that very fine education. He's probably with his mother maybe for, 3 years. When he grew up, the sense of this is that he's weaned and that he's out of diapers. He's kind of like a toddler. So he's probably 3-4 years old, something like that. Apparently the relationship with this daughter of Pharaoh has been maintained, but now he goes into that family and is going to be reared in that family. And the next verse, which we will pick up next week, skips forward about 37 years. And so what happened in the little blank space between verse 10 and verse 11? Well, next week we'll talk about what happened and how then the events that are described of Moses killing this Egyptian, escaping to Midian could have taken place as they're described here. So I'll stop right there.